Hello, I'm Haslinda Amin in Singapore. COVID changed a lot of things, but even before the pandemic, the relationship between China and the US was fraying. Fast forward, and we've seen a battleground built on tech. From Huawei to Chinese shares trading in New York, from social to semiconductors. National security concerns on both sides have seen new regulations and crackdowns. Supply chains are being reimagined, and companies are being forced to find new markets, new places to do business. One of the regions that stands to benefit most is Southeast Asia. With big tech ambitions and a thriving chip industry, the opportunities for ASEAN are huge. Joining us for this episode of New Directions, Dave West, President for Cisco Asia Pacific, Japan, and Greater China. Hui Min Yen, APEC CFO at semiconductor giant Infineon, and James Crabtree, Executive Director at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Asia. James, Hui Min, Dave, thank you so much for joining us. We know that semiconductors have become a geopolitical issue with the US and China battling for tech supremacy. James, put this in perspective for us. We know that over COVID, the US realized that it's been too reliant on outsourcing. Now, chips have become a national priority.
I think what you had before was the Americans looking at China and thinking that they were suspicious of individual companies like Huawei. Over time, they've decided that that's not enough, that the threat that China poses to American national security is enough that they now have to try and stop China getting whole categories of technology, of which advanced semiconductors is the most obvious. So we've moved from what they call an entity-based approach to a technological-based approach. And so the regulations the Americans put out last October attempted to stop China getting access to almost any advanced semiconductors at all.
Dave, needless to say, the tensions between the two sides creating complications for companies to do business. How are you assessing risks when it comes to US-China tensions, in particular the chip space?
Well, the world has changed significantly over the last few years. Technology is at the forefront of everything. And as James said, it is top of mind for not only government leaders, but business leaders as well. It used to be that technology was a finance discussion. It was a cost center. Now it's vital to business. And so as we look at sort of the risks that we're seeing in the market, we are staying very focused on our customers. They'll tell us everything. So the more that we can stay closer to them, the business outcomes they want to achieve. We're not politicians, and so I can't define what that looks like. What I can define is the solutions we deliver to our customers, the capabilities we deliver to our partners. And if we stay very true to that, I think it will guide us.
Women, whether it's decoupling or de-risking, it is about diversifying, and ASEAN can only benefit.
Yeah, it's true. We have a very big presence already in ASEAN. We are located in 6 countries, and we have a very big presence in Malaysia, where we house already now more than 12,000 employees, and we run a back-end fac and also a fabrication in Kulim, and also an assembly plant in Malacca. And in such a way where semiconductor has become such an indispensable part of our life, the demand coming from IoT, the demand coming from renewable energies is just spectacular, right, at the moment. And with that, we grow within our presence of the sites that we are operating and to scale them up.
Dave?
I think of it much broader than just semiconductors. When you think about building products and services and capabilities, semiconductors is one piece of the overall puzzle. And I think that's where ASEAN comes in. There's a lot of components. You've got to build power supplies and sources that go in there, diodes, capacitors, just so many things that go into building products and capabilities. I think that's the greatest potential. Everyone's very fixated right now on semiconductors. But if you get a semiconductor and you don't have the other components, you don't ship a product. And so you've got to look at the whole ecosystem and the supply chain. And I think that's potentially the greatest opportunity for ASEAN.
Dave talked about the ecosystem. It's interesting because for there to be an ecosystem, you need all 10 ASEAN member nations to work together with a common vision. And, James, it's not really happening because ASEAN countries look at each other as competitors first, I think. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, I completely agree with Dave that thinking about the semiconductor piece, thinking about it as a manufacturing issue is not very smart for ASEAN because really most of the world's semiconductor manufacturing happens in Taiwan, and even the Japanese, the Americans, and the Germans have to shell out enormous amounts of money to persuade these companies to set up new manufacturing facilities. So as I say, there are some dotted around the region, but the idea that ASEAN countries are going to build these enormously expensive $20 billion fabs isn't really realistic. So I don't think that whether or not ASEAN decides to work together on a common regional vision will make much difference. In the end, what matters is whether or not Malaysia, Thailand, maybe Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, those 5 countries in particular, can come up with a business environment which is conducive to international investment.
Do you agree, women? I mean, can ASEAN have that ecosystem without having to work together and have a common vision?
It's not possible. Just look at the area of renewable energy. This is now the hot topic in town. We as manufacturers, we need green energy. Our products contribute in other areas of bringing more green energy in a much more efficient manner. And just sourcing for green energy, it's a challenge here in Singapore and also in the region, but just not enough infrastructure available. There's not enough investment in there to make the solar farms, to make the wind farms. And so that becomes really a problem. But if you look at the availability of green energy in this region, this is definitely still a long way to go. And that needs, of course, countries in ASEAN, the governments to work together, how to have a common standing upon the standardization and how to make this solar and wind power in a much more available, right, to the countries in the ASEAN.
So where is the potential in the individual ASEAN countries? Indonesia, for instance, the largest ASEAN country economy in Southeast Asia. Would it be in what? Software? And what would be the strength of the respective countries?
Well, I think we've seen Vietnam has been incredibly strong for manufacturing. It's been a place that allows business to be done, and an ecosystem has sort of followed along the way to allow us and others to build in Vietnam. In Thailand, the automotive industry has always been strong in Thailand, but it's accelerating in Thailand because there's an ecosystem to support it. In Indonesia, very young population. I mean, ASEAN overall, I think 60% of the population is less than 35 years old. So, born digital natives, born with technology, understand it. So I think there's an opportunity around software development and acceleration in that area. But it will all depend on upskilling and skilling the masses to be able to make that happen.
But in terms of the potential for the individual countries, how are you looking at it?
We have recently put Vietnam into our focus plan. And that's simply because they are also close now to really Vietnam homegrown customers, right? And that we also need we need to also have a facing to the customers that are already located in Vietnam. And there we see then the potential that they also have a very young talent pipeline for engineering. And hence that makes it very ideal for us, right, in terms of the cost positions and in terms of availability of talents, that we will start to do some design activities in there and to beef up a bit of R&D capabilities, especially in the customer application area.
Skills are going to be fundamental to success here. I think for countries to be competitive on the global stage the way that we're talking about here, they have to have talent. They've got to be able to upskill the talent that they have. They have to develop the next wave of talent. They need a national agenda, focused on building digital skills, the next generation of skills, the expertise needed to manufacture, to design, to do software development, to be entrepreneurs, and to build the ecosystem the way it needs to be built to be competitive on the global stage.
Up next, the Internet of Things, AI, and 5G. We'll explore how ASEAN moves up the value chain as it looks to accelerate tech in a new direction. That's coming up. This is Bloomberg. Semiconductors and electronics are big business in Southeast Asia. 6% of GDP in Malaysia, 7% in Singapore, 10% in Thailand and the Philippines. Before COVID, ASEAN accounted for almost a quarter of global semiconductor exports, worth about $200 billion a year. The industry is growing fast, but to take full advantage, the region must quickly find ways to move up the value chain. As it stands now, the US still leads when it comes to cutting-edge technology. North Asia is catching up pretty fast. We have the likes of Taiwan, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia trying to jump on the bandwagon and try to play catch-up as well. But this against a backdrop of India as well, accelerating that pace. I mean, how does ASEAN compete when we're lacking that vision?
Well, I don't think it does. I mean, if we're still talking about semiconductors, then the pattern that you see is that Taiwan is the world's leading semiconductor maker, and the gap between Taiwan and everyone else is growing. It's not shrinking. So I think the idea that somehow ASEAN is going to become a leader in that particular sector isn't very realistic. What it has to do is find its niches within the supply chain that makes semiconductors, particularly at the lower end, as other countries move out of that and move higher up the value chain.
Where can it lead then, if not semiconductors?
Well, I think finding its niche is going to be really important. Maybe it is in the whole digital transformation. Maybe it's starting to leverage the 700 million population that's across a young, aspiring, digital native, hungry population. Maybe it is in software. Maybe it's in the startup community. Maybe it's in entrepreneurship. Those are areas where I think ASEAN, in fact, can lead. It doesn't need to be a laggard in those areas. But in semiconductors, there's miles or kilometers of distance between where TSMC is, where Samsung is, and where ASEAN needs to be a leader in the market.
And the niche would be?
Yeah, I think the ecosystem is really now the opportunity or the bright spot for the ASEAN countries. They may not have the highest in terms of technology and innovation, but they certainly can participate in putting the resources that's needed to make the semiconductor components, the materials that we use. And by far, the way we do manufacturing in semiconductor is also increasing in terms of innovative expertise, right, in a sense. So it's not the same way of manufacturing that we have done in the past, but it's also a much more upgraded and more sophisticated manufacturing coming forward.
Everyone is fixated on semiconductors because that's where the battle is for supremacy. So taking what you've just said into consideration, Hui Min, I mean, how is Infineon invested in the region? When it looks to deploy funds in the region, is it a case of looking at the region as a whole, 10 nations, or individual countries? I mean, what are the key considerations for Infineon?
I think, first of all, the market is it's growing nicely for us. We have a revenue of 14 billion euros. We have 56,200 employees at the moment globally, of which 40% of the people sit here in the region. So we are very heavy in manufacturing facilities here in this region. But essentially, when we look at ASEAN, we're looking as a region as a whole, but also individually countries. As I have said, we are present in 6 countries, relatively big in Malaysia, smaller in Thailand. And some of this diversification of considerations are also there. We want to continue to make Malaysia a much bigger presence than what we are. Can a facility in Vietnam or the people or talent that we can find in Vietnam would able to do the same job as what our Malaysian counterparts could do? So these are all diversification considerations that we have as well when we think about investing in the region.
Dave, how do you look at investing in the region?
Well, we have an ASEAN region group. So it's all of our countries, all 10 countries sit under an ASEAN region group. And then we look at what's a country national agenda, what's their startup initiatives, how invested are they in digitization, where are they going to be in the next few years. It really defines how we invest in ASEAN. Most people don't know this, but 80% of all internet traffic rides across Cisco in one way or another. So we're very heavily invested today. And Singapore is usually the starting point for everything that we do. When we bring a new cloud service, a new capability, a new innovation, we typically bring it to Singapore first. We learn here, and then we branch out to the others. And so our investment in this part of the world won't slow down. We think it will accelerate. We're looking at countries like Indonesia, which are growing leaps and bounds. The work that's going on in Vietnam right now in manufacturing, clearly a focus for us. Thailand on what's going on with automotive. It doesn't matter which automotive industry is, manufacturing in Thailand. Cisco is probably there. And so we're very focused on this region. But we want to do more, and we want to see the region even accelerate faster.
Still ahead on New Directions, a look into the future of tech in ASEAN and what life might look like in the years ahead. That's next. This is Bloomberg. We have AI, IoT, EV, 5G, 6G by 2030, some say in the US. James, there are risks to this kind of technology, no?
I guess the biggest challenge is that if you look at the kind of manufacturing that made Asia rich, it was manufacturing products. And now, much of the time, you're manufacturing products, but you're also wrapping services around those. And the challenge with services is that they come with data, and data is increasingly viewed as a national security risk. And so that's why TikTok is so controversial. On the face of it, TikTok shouldn't be a national security risk. But because TikTok would reveal huge quantities of data about its users and who they are and where they live, the idea that TikTok, an ultimately Chinese-owned company, could have control of all of this data sends the Americans up the wall. But that's also true of cars. And so managing this is going to be a challenge for the Americans and for the Chinese, but also for those caught in the middle here in Southeast Asia.
Regulation, one of the biggest challenges?
I don't know if it's the biggest challenge.
One of the biggest?
It's definitely a challenge which would prevent companies like us from moving faster in areas. But as you started off, I think areas like EV, IoT, 5G, AI, those are areas where I believe countries have to go faster. These are $100 billion industries over the next 5 years. Think about EVs. You're going to be downloading firmware. You're going to be changing the user experience. It changes the entire ecosystem of support. And then where you put power stations and charging stations, think about IoT. There'll be 9 billion more connected devices in the next couple of years. It's a massive industry. Don't think about it just on the OT manufacturing side. It's in everything, every aspect of our lives. So I still think we're at our infancy in all of this. Regulation will play a role in how fast countries and businesses can move. But make no mistake, if we want to compete on the world stage today, we need to be moving faster.
Women, regulation?
Personally, I feel that this innovation space is getting so much, things are evolving, right? I don't think there's any single regulations that can resist and hold and stop us from doing business. And now post-COVID and with US tensions, we have to be really agile, right, in how we manage our supply chain. So all in all, I think internally, we are really reacting and trying to make ourselves in a better positions to cope with such disruptions and regulation changes, of course. But I would think in this very well-connected, globalized world, I don't think it's going to happen so quickly.
We can't talk about technology, semiconductors, chips, without talking about sustainability, because it touches every aspect of it. As you make your investments, as you think about your strategy for the future, how does sustainability fit into the whole picture for you?
It's core to everything that we do. In fact, in our supply chain, sustainability is at the forefront. How we use reusable components. We've redesigned almost 100 products at Cisco through COVID to make sure that we're able to use reuse across our product families, making sure as part of the circular economy that we can grab things back and reuse all of those components if we build new products. customers are now not only thinking about sustainability, they all have ESG KPIs. They're trying to think about how that impacts their employees, their business, the people they do business with, across all of the value chain. And so they're looking at sustainability as a critical factor for deciding who they do business with and then how they do business.
In the final minutes, I just want to get all of you to look into the crystal ball to see how technology in ASEAN would look in 10, 20 years' time. I mean, how do you see this playing out? How might society look like, and what would be the key issues for you?
The US and China can find a way of, not being best of friends, but of mucking along together reasonably well, then the future is pretty bright. If they can find a way of living with one another, which isn't impossible to imagine, it doesn't look like the most likely scenario at the moment, but it's not impossible to imagine that they look at their own self-interest, and in particular, they realize how disastrous a future, particularly military conflict, would be in an age of interconnected globalization, just at the nature of semiconductors. When you saw a couple of years ago how disastrous it was for the world economy to have a tiny shortfall in the number of semiconductors available to the world, any military activity surrounding Taiwan would be vastly worse than that. So there are good reasons to pull back from the brink on both sides. Nobody really wants that to happen. So, let's imagine that the US and China are able to do that, then the future is reasonably optimistic, particularly for this region.
I hope you don't come into a situation where you have to take sides to either China or US. Fundamentally, if you look at really back to ASEAN, as the companies invest, as foreign companies enter and build manufacturing facilities and invest in services, software, whatsoever, I think in general the living standards, the disposable income, and they will earn an income, right, which is nice, and they will have disposable income. They will be exposed to international content. They would want the quality life to improve. And with that in mind, I think that the young people in ASEAN will take a real proactive steps here to participate and really getting the government to come into the act. And I think the government will be forced to really do something in order to meet the desire of this young population.
I'm gonna side with both of them, right? So I am also an optimist. I see great potential in this region. And you look 10 years down the road, I think we'll see a lot of this fulfilled and that optimism come to reality. I think the investment as we look in the technology front, I think we're going to see AI become a much more pervasive part of our lives. In work, in business, in life, AI will become a bigger portion. Robotics will become main stage in 10 years. We'll see the realities and the value of quantum come into play in this region. Autonomous vehicles, we've been talking about them for a while. We're talking 10 to 20 years down the road. We're going to see autonomous vehicles, autonomous flight, and a lot of things that will hopefully improve the quality of life. And I think the region could be a hub for much of that. I think there's a lot of eyes on North Asia and South Asia right now. And I think the potential for this region is incredible. I'm hoping that we can realize it. And I'll side with James to say, as long as cool heads prevail in all of this, I think ASEAN could see incredible value over the next 10 to 20 years.